In the vast expanse of the galaxy, power was often held by the most ruthless, and the alien queen had ruled with an iron grip for centuries. Her empire had stretched across countless star systems, her name whispered with a mix of fear and respect. But even the mightiest fall, and now, she was a prisoner of her enemies, captured by a rival faction that had waited patiently for the moment to strike. Her once glorious empire was crumbling, her loyalists scattered, and her power reduced to nothing more than a memory. The great halls that once echoed with the sounds of triumph were now silent, filled only with the cold, oppressive atmosphere of defeat. The queen, a figure of both awe and terror, was now facing her end. Her captors, eager to display their dominance, had scheduled her execution for the following sunrise. The galaxy watched in anticipation, knowing that the death of the queen would mark the end of an era. Yet, as she sat alone in the dim light of her cell, there was no fear in her eyes, only a deep, unsettling calm. She had accepted her fate long before the shackles were placed around her wrists. What haunted her was not the thought of death, but the knowledge that her legacy would fade into nothingness, her people left to suffer under the rule of their conquerors. In the midst of this despair, a lone figure was called upon, a man named John Anderson. John was a former soldier, a veteran of countless battles, now serving as a diplomat for Earth. His transition from warrior to peacemaker had not been easy, but it had been necessary. War had taken its toll on him, leaving scars both seen and unseen. He had tried to leave that life behind, to bury the memories of the bloodshed and the chaos. But when the Queen's loyalists reached out to him, he found himself unable to refuse. They were desperate, clinging to the hope that John, with his reputation and skill, could find a way to save their fallen leader. John arrived at the Queen's prison under the cover of darkness, escorted by the few remaining loyalists who had risked everything to get him there. As he walked through the cold, stone corridors, memories of his past battles flickered through his mind, each step a reminder of the violence he had tried to forget. But this was different. This was not a battlefield. It was a place of inevitable doom. And yet, as he reached the Queen's cell, he felt an unfamiliar unease settle over him. He had faced death countless times, but never like this. Never in a place where hope seemed as distant as the stars. The heavy door creaked open, and John stepped inside. The Queen, once a towering figure of authority, now appeared fragile, her regal robes hanging loosely on her frail frame. Her eyes, however, still held the fire of her spirit, a fire that had not yet been extinguished by defeat. She looked at John with a mixture of curiosity and recognition, as if she had expected him all along. Without preamble, the Queen requested a private audience with John, dismissing the guards who had been stationed outside her cell. The loyalists exchanged uneasy glances but obeyed, leaving the two of them alone in the dimly lit chamber. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken questions and buried emotions. John had expected the Queen to plead for her life, to beg him to find a way to spare her from the executioner's blade. But she did not. Instead, she asked for something far more unexpected. She asked to spend her final moments with him. The request took John by surprise, leaving him momentarily speechless. He had anticipated anger, desperation, perhaps even threats. But this was something he had not been prepared for. The Queen explained that her request was not born of fear or a desire for comfort in her last hours. No, it was something much deeper. She had chosen John because of who he was, because of what he represented. To her, he was not just a diplomat, not just a former soldier. He was a symbol of the resilience and strength that had kept humanity alive through countless trials. She saw in him a connection that transcended the boundaries of species and politics, something that had been forged in the fires of shared struggle and survival. As John listened, he began to understand. The Queen was not asking for a savior, she was asking for a witness. Someone to see her not as the tyrant history would surely paint her as, but as a being who had lived, loved, and lost just like any other. She wanted John to be the one who would carry the truth of her final moments back to the galaxy, to ensure that her story did not end with her death, but lived on through the memories of those who would hear it. John, moved by the weight of her words, agreed. He would stay with her until the end, not as a diplomat, not as a soldier, but as a human being who had seen too much death to let another pass unnoticed. And so, in that quiet, cold cell, they sat together, two beings from different worlds, bound by the inevitable approach of death and the shared understanding of what it meant to face it with dignity. As the hours slipped away, the Queen began to speak, her voice carrying the weight of ages. She shared with John a story that had been buried deep in the annals of history, a tale known only to a few in her dying empire. It was a history that stretched back to a time when her kind and humans had not been strangers but allies. In the eons before the galaxy was divided by war and conquest, their two species had once stood side by side against a common enemy. They had shared knowledge, culture, and most importantly, a bond that had been thought unbreakable. But as centuries passed, the records of this alliance had faded, replaced by the conflicts and rivalries that now defined their relationship. The Queen spoke of how her ancestors had once revered the resilience and adaptability of humanity, traits that had made humans invaluable in the ancient wars that had shaped the galaxy. Yet, over time, as the threats subsided and power struggles began, the alliance was forgotten, buried beneath the layers of new enmities and ambitions. John listened in stunned silence, struggling to reconcile this revelation with everything he had known. The Queen's words were almost impossible to believe. How could something so significant have been erased from history? Yet, as she continued, the conviction in her voice began to stir something deep within him, memories long suppressed by the demands of his military career. He remembered the tales of mysterious allies that had been passed down through the ranks, stories dismissed as mere legends. But now, hearing the Queen, those legends seemed to take on a new light. His skepticism lingered, but it was no longer as firm as it had been moments before. The idea that humans and the Queen's race had once shared such a profound connection felt almost too grand to be real. And yet, in the silence that followed her revelation, John couldn't shake the sense that there was truth in her words, a truth that had been obscured by the passage of time and the fog of war. The Queen, sensing his internal conflict, reached into the folds of her tattered robes and produced a small, intricately carved object. It was a relic, old and worn, yet still radiating a sense of importance. She held it out to John, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that brooked no denial. This, she explained, was a symbol of the bond their ancestors had forged, a bond that had been passed down through her lineage as a reminder of what once was and could be again. John took the relic, feeling its weight in his hand, and as he did, a wave of recognition washed over him. The carvings, the symbols, they were familiar, eerily so. He had seen something like this before, buried deep in the archives of Earth's oldest histories, in stories told by his grandmother, who had always believed in the old ways, in the connections between all living things. The realization hit him like a thunderbolt. This was no mere artifact. It was a link to the past, a past that he and his people had unknowingly shared with the Queen's kind. The Queen's gaze softened as she watched the understanding dawn on him. She knew that the relic would speak to him in a way that words could not. It was a physical manifestation of their shared heritage, a reminder of the strength that came from unity, a strength that had been lost but could perhaps be found again. She didn't need to say anything more. The relic had done what she had hoped. It had awakened in John a sense of purpose, a duty to not only honor the past but to protect the future. As John held the relic, his skepticism melted away, replaced by a profound sense of connection to something larger than himself, larger than the wars and conflicts that had defined his life. The Queen's revelation had not just been a tale of lost history, it had been a call to remember who they were, and who they could be if they chose to embrace their shared legacy. As the weight of the revelation settled in, the Queen's loyalists gathered in the shadows, their faces etched with determination and fear. They knew the clock was ticking, and their leader's execution was only hours away. For them, the idea of doing nothing was unthinkable. They owed their Queen everything. She had led them through countless victories, and now, in her darkest hour, they could not abandon her to die alone. Driven by this unyielding loyalty, they began to craft a desperate plan to rescue her, a plan fraught with risks and uncertainties. John found himself torn. The bond he had formed with the Queen, The connection he now understood ran deeper than he ever imagined, pulled him into their cause. His soldier's instincts screamed at him to stay out of a mission that seemed doomed to fail, but his heart couldn't let him walk away. He saw in the Loyalist's eyes the same resolve he had once carried into battle, a resolve born not just from duty but from love, respect, and a fierce desire to protect. Despite every logical argument against it, he agreed to help them. The decision weighed heavily on him, but it was a burden he knew he had to carry. The plan was audacious. Break into the heavily fortified facility where the Queen was held, overpower the guards, and escape before anyone could sound the alarm. The odds were stacked against them, and they all knew it. Yet, as they gathered their weapons, whispered their strategies, and prepared for the mission ahead, there was a palpable sense of determination in the air. Each Loyalist knew the price of failure, and the fear that gripped their hearts only sharpened their focus. John could feel the tension building with every passing minute. The facility was a fortress, designed to be impenetrable, and the Loyalists had no illusions about what they were up against. Doubts began to creep in, gnawing at the edges of their confidence. What if they couldn't get to her in time? What if the plan failed and they were all captured or killed? The fear was real, but so was their resolve. They had come too far to turn back now. As they approached the facility, every step felt like a test of their courage. The night was still, the air thick with the anticipation of the battle to come. Each Loyalist carried their fears silently, their faces set in grim determination. John, too, felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had been in countless dangerous situations before, but this felt different. The stakes were higher, the consequences more profound. It wasn't just a life they were fighting for, it was the future of an entire people, a legacy that could not be allowed to die with the Queen. But just as they were about to make their move, the Queen herself intervened. With a calm that belied the gravity of the situation, she revealed her true intentions. She had never planned to escape, had never intended to run from her fate. The escape plan, the gathering of her Loyalists, even John's involvement, it had all been part of her final act of defiance. But not in the way they had expected. The Queen's voice, steady and resolute, cut through the tension like a blade. She explained that her death was not the end but a necessary sacrifice. She believed that by embracing her fate, she could achieve something far greater than any rescue attempt could offer. Her death, witnessed by the galaxy, would become a symbol, a martyrdom that could inspire her people to rise again, to reclaim their lost glory in her name. She saw her end not as a defeat but as the beginning of a new chapter, one that required her to face death with dignity and courage. John was stunned. The Loyalists, too, stood in silence, their plan unraveling before them. The Queen's words left them with no choice but to respect her wishes, even though it tore at their hearts to do so. In that moment, they realized that her strength lay not in clinging to life but in choosing how she would face the end. They had come to save her, but instead, they had to let her go, honoring her decision and the legacy she intended to leave behind. The hour had come. The Queen, regal even in chains, was led to the place where her life would end. The air was thick with the weight of finality, every step echoing the somber reality that this was not just an execution, but the close of an era. John walked beside her, his heart heavy with the knowledge that nothing could change what was about to happen. Yet he remained by her side, bound by a sense of duty and an inexplicable connection that had grown stronger with each passing moment. As they reached the execution site, a cold silence settled over the gathered onlookers. The Queen stood tall, unbowed by the chains that bound her, her gaze steady as she faced her fate. In her eyes there was no fear, only a deep, unshakable resolve. John could feel the tension in the air, the anticipation of those who had come to witness the fall of a legend. But the Queen had not come to this moment unprepared. In a voice that resonated with the power of her ancestors, she began a ritual, one that had been passed down through generations, known only to the royal lineage. The words she spoke were ancient, their meaning lost to all but a few, yet they carried an undeniable force. As she chanted, a subtle change swept over the atmosphere, something primal and powerful awakening in the space between them. John watched in awe as the Queen's presence seemed to expand, her very essence radiating with a strength that defied the finality of death. He felt a pull, a connection that transcended the physical, drawing him into the ritual. The Queen's eyes, glowing with an inner light, met his, and in that moment he understood. This was her final act, a passing of the torch. The ritual was designed not just to transfer her power but to ensure that her legacy would live on through him. The energy that had sustained her, the wisdom of her people, the strength of her lineage, all of it began to flow into John, filling him with a force unlike anything he had ever known. As the ritual reached its climax, John felt himself changing. It was as if the very fabric of his being was being rewoven, each thread infused with the essence of the Queen's power and knowledge. His mind expanded, the memories and experiences of her people flooding his consciousness. He could see their history, feel their struggles, understand their hopes and fears as if they were his own. It was overwhelming, yet it brought with it a clarity he had never before experienced. The transformation was not just physical, it was a profound shift in his very soul. He could feel the Queen's presence within him, a guiding force that would stay with him for the rest of his days. Her wisdom became his, her strength fortified his own, and with it came a deeper understanding of the connection between their species. The barriers that had once seemed so insurmountable now felt like mere illusions, ready to be torn down. With the ritual complete, the Queen's strength began to wane. Her once powerful form grew frail, her life force now a part of John. She looked at him one last time, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. She had given him everything she had left, and now, with her final breath, she would ask him to carry on her mission. Drawing close, her voice barely a whisper, she spoke her last words to him. She urged him to use the power she had bestowed upon him not for revenge or conquest, but to forge a new path, one of peace and understanding between their peoples. She implored him to remember that their shared history was not just a relic of the past, but a foundation upon which they could build a future. A future where the mistakes of the past could be avoided, and a lasting peace could be achieved. As she breathed her last, the Queen's eyes closed, and with her passing, the galaxy lost one of its greatest rulers. But in her death, she had sown the seeds of something greater, a hope that through John, her legacy would endure, and the bond between their species would once again flourish. John returned to Earth, but it was no longer the world he had known. The sky was the same, the streets familiar, yet everything felt different. He carried with him a weight that went beyond mere memories. It was the burden of a dying queen's last wish, the immense power she had entrusted to him, and the responsibility of ensuring that her sacrifice was not in vain. The quiet hum of everyday life around him contrasted sharply with the storm that now raged within. Each step he took felt heavier, as if the ground beneath him knew that he was no longer just John Anderson, the diplomat and soldier, but something more, a living vessel of the Queen's legacy. Adjusting to his new reality was no easy task. The power that now coursed through him was a constant reminder of what had transpired. It was more than just physical strength. It was a deep well of knowledge, memories, and emotions from a species that had seen the rise and fall of empires. At times, it felt overwhelming, as if he could drown in the sheer depth of it all. The voices of the past echoed in his mind, guiding him, urging him to fulfill the promise he had made. Yet he was haunted by doubt. Could he really bring about the change the Queen had envisioned? Could he bridge the gap between their worlds and forge a path to peace? Every decision weighed heavily on him. The more he delved into the power he had inherited, the more he realized how monumental the task ahead was. He was no longer just acting on behalf of humanity. He was now a representative of something much larger, a symbol of hope for a future where war and hatred could be replaced by understanding and unity. But with this realization came fear. Fear that he might fail, fear that the burden was too great for any one person to bear. Yet in his heart he knew he had no choice but to try. The Queen's last words echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of what was at stake. As the news of the Queen's death and John's transformation spread, the galaxy erupted in a frenzy. The Galactic Council, once poised to exploit the power vacuum left by her demise, found themselves blindsided by the unexpected turn of events. The Queen's death should have marked the beginning of their domination, but instead, it introduced an element they had not anticipated, a human now imbued with the very power they had sought to control. This revelation sent shockwaves through the ranks of the council, causing factions to reconsider their plans and alliances. The council members, who had once seen humanity as little more than a minor player in the grand scheme of things, now viewed John with a mixture of fear and respect. He was an unknown variable, a wild card that could tip the balance of power in ways they could not predict. The initial attempts to undermine him were met with unexpected resistance, as John's newfound abilities allowed him to navigate the political landscape with a deftness that surprised even the most seasoned strategists. The council's carefully laid plans began to unravel, and they were forced to acknowledge that the Queen's legacy was far from extinguished. In the midst of this turmoil, John made his move. Drawing upon the wisdom he had inherited, he began to reach out to the Queen's former enemies, those who had once sought her destruction. He knew that if there was any hope of lasting peace, it had to start with them. His approach was cautious, measured, but underpinned by the strength that now defined him. He spoke not just as a human but as a bearer of the Queen's legacy, appealing to their shared history and the ancient connection that bound them together. The initial meetings were tense, filled with suspicion and lingering animosities. But as John spoke, something remarkable began to happen. The leaders who had once been hell-bent on conquest and revenge started to listen. They recognized the truth in his words, the potential for a future that did not need to be written in blood. Slowly, the barriers of mistrust began to erode, replaced by a tentative hope that maybe, just maybe, peace was possible. John knew that this was only the beginning. The road ahead was long, fraught with challenges and setbacks. But as he looked into the eyes of those who had once been his enemies and saw the first glimmers of understanding, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The Queen's sacrifice had not been in vain. It had lit a spark, one that, if nurtured, could grow into a flame capable of illuminating the darkest corners of the galaxy. As the days turned into weeks, the talks continued, each one bringing them closer to the goal the Queen had envisioned. And while the future remained uncertain, one thing was clear: John was no longer alone in this mission. He had allies, old and new, united by the desire to honor the Queen's legacy and to build something greater than any of them could have imagined. The seeds of unity had been planted, and with each passing day, they began to take root, suggesting that perhaps, after all the loss and suffering, a new era of peace was within reach.